So, first rule of being a prosecutor, don't ask questions you don't know the answer to. Actually, let me rephrase. There's a rule before that. Don't bring a prosecution that is so bad that your prosecution looks like the defense case. That would be the actual first rule. The second rule is don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. The prosecution in the Kyle Rittenhouse case decided to violate both of those rules. There was no evidence that Kyle Rittenhouse murdered anybody on that night in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The self-defense case is absolutely crystal clear. It is clear from the footage. It is clear from the testimony. Every time somebody testifies on behalf of the prosecution, within about 35 seconds, they're now testifying on behalf of the defense. And that's precisely what happened in Rittenhouse's trial yesterday. You remember the case of Kyle Rittenhouse in Wisconsin. He went to Kenosha, Wisconsin because there had been a bunch of riots. There weren't enough police officers there. He went to provide medical aid to people. He's on video discussing this. He went to defend essentially car lots from being burned up by rioters. And then he was caught alone by a bunch of Antifa thugs. He was chased. They threatened him. A shot was fired in the air. Somebody was lunging for his gun. He shot them. Then he ran away because the riot started to follow him again. And then he was attacked by a man with a skateboard, tried to bash him in the head, shot that guy. And then there was another person who approached and tried to jump on him and beat him. And he shot that person. And that person who tried to jump on him wasn't actually trying to jump on him. He was trying to shoot him. Okay, so that's pretty obvious self-defense. It's pretty obvious from all of the available tape and all of the available testimony. And from the get-go, we knew that the people who had engaged in the violence with Rittenhouse were ne'er-do-wells at the very best. Okay, most of them actually were just terrible criminals, as it turns out. One of the people who was shot was an actual sex offender. Another person who was shot and did not die was pretty obviously an Antifa member. He admitted that he was affiliated with a group called the People's Revolution, which is a communist militia group, that his gun permit had expired, that he had lied to the police shortly after the shooting, and that he himself is financially rewarded, essentially, if Rittenhouse is found guilty. It's all really, really ugly stuff. So one of the clips here is just incredible. Okay, so it's unbelievable, actually. So he's an Antifa quote-unquote medic. He was carrying a gun. In 2016, he was found guilty of breaking Wisconsin's law governing the use of dangerous weapons, per Milwaukee County court records. He'd gone somewhere armed while intoxicated. He had received tickets for minor offenses, including disobeying police officers and making loud noises. And again, he was deeply associated with this Antifa group. Well, things got very ugly for him on the witness stand yesterday when he was asked specifically about when he was shot. Okay, because the theory of the prosecution, based on not only no evidence, but like counter the evidence, is that Rittenhouse shot this person, Gaige Grosskreutz, that he shot him for no reason at all and that he was not acting in self-defense. Here is Gaige Grosskreutz admitting that he was shot while attempting to shoot Kyle Rittenhouse.
It wasn't until you pointed your gun at him, advanced on him with your gun, now your hands down, pointed at him, that he fired, right?
Correct.
Okay, and if you actually had the rest of this clip, you would see that the prosecutor puts his head in his hands. Right? I mean, he actually gets up and he shouts directed verdict, which means a directed verdict is where you say that the prosecution not only does not have the evidence to prove its case, but that it never should have been brought at all, that the judge should not even send this to a jury, that the witnesses have now essentially testified to the innocence of that even the prosecution witnesses are now testifying to the innocence of Kyle Rittenhouse on the self-defense defense. As Ace of Spades points out, Grosskreutz drew out his gun and aimed it at Rittenhouse's head. He did this as his Antifa Confederate was swinging a large skateboard at Rittenhouse's head and getting shot for that. In response to Huber pointing a gun at his head, Rittenhouse aimed and fired at him, hit Huber in the arm. It was a devastating injury that ripped 90% of the muscle of his bicep, but Grosskreuz's testimony is even more devastating for the prosecution because, again, there he is saying that pointing a gun at the guy who shot him. Yeah, that's and then the defense attorney gets up and starts shouting directed verdict. Okay, so here is how the media cover this because they have to try to pretend that this is an actual case. This is the part that's unbelievable. Here is how the media covers this. Okay, the media covered this way. Headline from CBS News. Lone survivor shot by Kyle Rittenhouse at Kenosha protest testified he thought he was going to die. Here's the headline from the Washington Post. Gaige Grosskreutz says he feared for his life before Kyle Rittenhouse shot him during Kenosha unrest. Here's the Daily Beast. The man who survived being shot by Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin last August testified on Monday he never tried to kill the heavily armed teenager. In fact, he said at the teen's murder trial he was actually trying to surrender to him. Okay, and here was NBC News' takeaway. Quote, Kyle Rittenhouse shooting victim says he thought he was going to die. Okay, so I'm sorry, but that's not the story. The story is that he admitted that he was pointing a gun at the defendant when the defendant shot him. Here's the opener from the New York Times, however, how it was covered. Quote, Gaige Grosskreutz, the only person who survived being shot by Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin, took the witness stand on Monday and described the instant he faced Mr. Rittenhouse. What was going through your head at this particular moment, said Thomas Binger, the prosecutor. That I was going to die, said Mr. Grosskreutz, a volunteer paramedic. The description there. And then here's where they get to the point. Okay, as the prosecution's case in the homicide trial of Mr. Rittenhouse nears an end, Grosskreutz, 28, calmly delivered for several hours as a star witness for the state, but his testimony at times lent support to Mr. Rittenhouse's central claim that he was acting in self-defense when he shot Mr. Grosskreutz and two other men. The testimony underscored a broader challenge for prosecutors. Yeah, you think? You think? Under cross-examination, Grosskreutz gave testimony that suggested his role in the events was complicated. Like Mr. Rittenhouse, Mr. Grosskreutz was armed that night, and he was asked why he had falsely told police detectives shortly after the shooting that his Glock pistol had fallen out of his holster that night, rather than saying he had pulled it, as visual evidence showed. So he lied to the cops. He told them the reason his gun was out when they arrived and he was, holding his now gone bicep, that when the reason his gun was out, he said, is because it fell out. Except that on video, he pulls out the gun and he's raising it to point it at the defendant. Under questioning, he acknowledged he was carrying the gun concealed without a valid permit and that he had denied a request from the police in September 2020 to interview him about the shootings. Corey Chirafassi says, when you were standing, as the lawyer for the defense said, so when you were standing 3 to 5 feet from him with your arms up in the air, he never fired, right? Correct, Mr. Grosskreutz answered. It wasn't until you pointed your gun at him, advanced on him with your gun, now your hands down, pointed at him that he fired, correct? Correct, he said. And the headline is, he thought he was going to die. In what world is that the headline? This case is over. It never should have been brought, but it demonstrates how prosecutors, their incentive structures are such that they will bring faulty prosecutions so long as they believe that the left media want them to do so. That is hideous and ugly stuff. We have prosecutors across the country who are being driven by the left-wing political agenda, not prosecuting actual crimes in San Francisco, but prosecuting non-crimes in Kenosha, Wisconsin, based on the whims of the national media, who then proceed to cover up the actual facts of the case in a wide variety of these cases. Man, you gotta fear acting in self-defense in a state where the media have sway. We're in a battle for the culture and for our values. Like and subscribe to help keep our videos on the front line of the fight and top of your feed.